Every 4 years, iconic cities around the world compete for a chance to host the Olympic Games, the world's biggest sports competition. But here's the big question. How much exactly does it cost to host the Olympics? The first thing a city looking to host the Olympics will realize is that the cost of hosting the Olympics actually starts with the bidding process for a chance to host the Olympics. Now, this essentially means that any host city starts spending money on the Olympics even before getting a chance to host it. So the first cost of hosting the Olympics is the cost of bidding. Research estimates suggest that most cities will spend between $50 to $100 million on the bidding process. Now, this covers the cost of travel, planning the bid, and hiring consultants to create ambitious ideas to help win the bidding process. For instance, Tokyo spent around $75 million on a successful bid to host the 2020 Olympics. But the biggest story here is that cities can sometimes spend tens of millions of dollars and still fail to win the bid. Again, take Tokyo as an example. Before winning the rights to host the 2020 Olympics, it spent $150 million on a failed bid to host the 2016 Olympics. In fact, the cost of bidding is so high, some cities pull out of the process just because they can't afford the cost of bidding alone. Now, because the bidding process is essentially a competition, the amount spent by potential host cities is typically based on the number of competing bids. For example, Paris 2024 faced competition from only Los Angeles, which ended up getting the rights to host the 2028 Olympics itself. So to reiterate, most cities will spend about $100 million just to put together a bid to host the Olympics. But what happens if that bid is successful? A host city for the Olympics is usually announced about 7 years in advance, giving the host enough time and runway to properly prepare for the event. And what do sporting competitions require more than anything else? The answer is stadiums. But not just any stadiums, usually specialized stadiums specific to different sports and also usually built from scratch. So the next big cost for a host city would be the cost of sports infrastructure. For starters, the host city will need a venue large enough to host the opening and closing ceremonies. It will also need highly specialized sports facilities for sports like indoor cycling and for the different types of swimming events, but also for sports that you didn't even realize were sports, like roller speed skating and breakdancing. Yes, breakdancing will be a sport at the Olympics for the first time in 2024. Now, the cost of building these venues varies, but for context, Japan spent an estimated $3 billion on building new venues for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, with the main stadium alone costing $1.4 billion. One way to reduce the incredibly high cost of sports infrastructure is to avoid building new venues, and that is exactly what Paris is doing. For the 2024 Olympics, Paris is repurposing existing venues and creating temporary ones by taking advantage of the city's many iconic landmarks. For instance, the Parc des Princes Stadium and the Roland Garros Arena will host sports like soccer, boxing, and tennis, while fencing and taekwondo will be held at the Grand Palais. And perhaps most iconic of all, the outdoor space around the Eiffel Tower will host beach volleyball games. Now, all of this means that Paris is only building 2 new arenas from scratch: the Porte de la Chapelle Arena, which will host badminton and gymnastics, and the Paris Aquatic Center, which will host diving, water polo, and other swimming events. But there's one other sports infrastructure cost that not even Paris can avoid: building an Olympic village. One of the requirements of hosting the Olympics is building an Olympic village large enough to host the 15,000 athletes expected from all the participating countries, as well as the referees and officials for the games. If building a residential village for 15,000 people sounds expensive, well, that's because it is. For example, Paris spent about $1.8 billion on building its Olympic village for the 2024 Olympics. The next big cost is the cost of public infrastructure, especially housing and transportation. For starters, the International Olympic Committee requires host cities to have a minimum of 40,000 hotel rooms to be available for visiting spectators during the games. But for cities that don't have 40,000 hotel rooms, there's a simple solution: build more hotels. For example, Rio de Janeiro built 79 new hotels to create an additional 15,000 hotel rooms in the city ahead of hosting the 2016 games. But hotel rooms are just one part of the equation. Host cities also typically have to spend billions on other public infrastructure costs, like transport networks, to ensure that the millions of people who come into the city for the Olympics can move around easily. Again, for context, over half of Beijing's $45 billion budget for the 2008 Olympics went to investments in railroad and airport projects. But what happens if you successfully get millions of people to come into your city, stay in fancy hotels, and move around the city without stress? Well, you also have to protect them. Which brings us to the next big cost, the cost of security. So let's put this into perspective. The population of Paris is just over 2 million people, but the city expects 15 million guests and tourists to attend the Olympics, which is more than 7 times the size of its normal population. This poses an obvious security concern and will require any host to massively invest in security personnel and technology to properly protect the games. Unfortunately for host cities, the cost of security has gone up significantly since the 9/11 attacks, with the first Olympics held after those attacks, the Athens 2004 Olympics, spending $1.5 billion on security. Now, since then, host cities have typically spent between $1 to $2 billion on ensuring proper security during the Olympic Games. Asides this, there are also operational costs covering things like event management, organization, and preparation for the opening and closing ceremonies at the Games. But there's also the future cost of the Olympics, which only starts to count after the Games are over. Let's call this the cost of maintenance. Because host cities tend to build massive, outlandish sports infrastructure just to host a 1-month-long event, those arenas and stadiums often wind up being white elephant projects that are abandoned or have limited use after the Olympics. Now, when they are not abandoned, these stadiums will need to be maintained, and any debt accrued during their construction will also need to be paid off. For example, Sydney's Olympic Stadium for the 2000 Olympics cost the city $30 million a year to maintain, while Beijing Stadium for the 2008 Olympics requires $10 million a year to maintain. Now, the big picture here is that these massive hosting costs mean that more often than not, the host city goes over budget as it prepares to host the Olympics. In fact, every Olympic Games in recent years has gone over budget, and as it turns out, this applies to both the Summer and Winter Games. The incredibly high cost of hosting and the very real risk of going over budget to host a 1-month-long event raises a very obvious question. Why would any city want to host the Olympics? The main obvious reason is that these cities want to be associated with the prestige of the most famous sporting competition in the world. But it's hard to place a real monetary value on that prestige. So let's take a look at this from an economic perspective instead. One of the biggest economic upsides of hosting the Olympics is the revenue that it can generate, with lots of brands eager to partner with the Olympics and billions of people around the world eager to watch sports that they didn't even realize were sports, like mountain biking and synchronized diving, which, by the way, looks like this.
1, 2, 3, go.
The Tokyo 2020 Olympics generated $5.8 billion in revenue, but the Olympics itself cost $13 billion to host. So just like many other games before it, the reality is that most host cities tend to end up in a deficit. Now, host cities also claim to benefit from spikes in tourism and jobs, but some studies have shown that those two benefits are typically short-term. Finally, host cities also often justify their massive expenditure on the Olympics with claims that investments in public infrastructure like brand new road projects will outlive the Olympic Games. But the simple counter-argument there is that no country needs to first host the Olympics before investing in brand new road projects for its citizens. Ultimately, as the Olympics gets larger, with every edition having more sports, more athletes, and more spectators, it's unlikely that the cost of hosting the Olympic Games will slow down anytime soon. What is likely though, is that the number of cities that can host the Games will actually start to shrink, and there's already a sobering data point to back up that theory. When Brisbane, Australia won the rights to host the 2032 Olympic Games, it became the first city to win a bid for the Olympics unopposed since 1984. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe as well, because that really helps this channel. And if you enjoyed this video, then watch this next. See you in the next one.